On this short video, I want to discuss a little bit the language of the Jewish people in the times of our forefathers. And it's related to what we find in our weekly reading in Parshat Miketz, when Yosef wants to create an impression that he is an Egyptian viceroy, and his brothers, of course, don't recognize him. It says that he spoke to them using a militz. Militz, today this word would mean more like an advocate, but in this week's Parsha, the meaning of militz is a translator, obviously, based on the context, and that's how the Aramaic translation uses the word miturgiman, translator, for the word militz. So the question is, first of all, was the language of the children of Yaakov some special language that only his family knew? Was the biblical Hebrew a unique language in some sense? We usually call it Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. That's in fact how many people perceive it, and apparently that was the opinion of our sages of the Talmud, that the Hebrew language was a very special language that apparently was unique to the Jewish people and maybe to some other special people, probably descendants, some of the descendants of Noah retained this language, maybe the Academy of Shem and Ever. But what's interesting is that Ramban says on this week's Parsha that the Hebrew language was the language of Canaanites. This was the native language of the local population, the Canaanites. And Ibn Ezra also says that in a different place in his commentary on Yeshaya. And it seems like this opinion actually is supported very well by archaeological findings, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If the language, the Hebrew language, was unique to the Jewish people, why did Yosef supposedly get the translator? And how would the brothers not figure out immediately that if somebody knows their language, he must be from very close member of the family, they should have known him before. What is this Egyptian translator doing? And they could have probably figured out pretty soon that it's a person who comes from at least Yosef's family, right? There are some opinions that the translator was actually his own son, Menashe, who was, by the way, quite young at this time. He might have been at most about 8 years old. So the opinion that the Hebrew language is in fact the language of Canaanites makes a lot of sense. And according to this, of course, the brothers weren't too surprised that somebody in Egypt knows this language. As Ramban writes, these are close by lands. The Egyptian language actually has some similarity, from the same group. The scientists quote Afro-Asiatic languages, the major group in which the Semitic languages, including the Hebrew, are part of. So it's not a big surprise that the brothers of Yosef didn't suspect anything unusual, that there are people who know their language. It's not their language, it's the language of the people of Canaan. One might wonder how the holiest of tongues would be spoken by one of the worst nations, probably. But the same question applies to why would the land of Canaan be given to the worst nation? Why would the Holy Land be given to Canaanites, who were despicable and used to sacrifice their own children and did all kinds of other terrible things, abominations of all kinds? It's just Hashem relates, in a certain sense, the language to the land. The Canaanites were given that land temporarily, and the language also associated with it. So what I wanted to discuss is the continuation of the Hebrew language throughout our history. A lot of the secular Jews or non-Jews might say something like this, that Hebrew was a dead language, and it was revived just 100 or so years ago, a little bit more than that, by the Zionists as part of the revival of the ancient Jewish language. And the truth of the matter is that it's completely not true perspective. The Hebrew language was never a dead language, and in any reasonable sense, there is no comparison between, for instance, how Italians don't really know Latin except they use it in the church if they're Catholic, and certainly the Greeks don't really know ancient Greek that well except the scholars or whoever else is involved with the specific writings of the ancient Greeks. The Hebrew, which is much older, of course, the biblical Hebrew is much further from our times than the Latin is from modern Italians. And still, the Hebrew was never abandoned by our people, and it was always used. First of all, every Jew a few times a week would hear the reading of the Torah in the synagogue, and that's of course in the Hebrew. Now there was a time period when during Babylonian exile and a little bit later than that they used to translate into Aramaic also the readings, but that was abandoned a long time ago, and pretty much every Jew knew some level of Hebrew to be able to pray in the original. It was almost unheard of that the regular people would pray in Yiddish. Among women it was quite common, but that the regular men, unless a person is a ger or for some other reason that the ger didn't know Yiddish either, he would pray probably in his language. There were not so many gerim, by the way, in Europe. Christian nations usually forbid people to convert to Judaism anyway. But my point is that the regular born Jew who was usually Orthodox, there was no concept of Orthodox at the time. Everybody was observant, and generally the way Jews lived for over 1,000 years in Europe, they all taught their children to at least understand the minimal. Everybody knew how to pray in Hebrew, everybody knew how to read the Torah at least, and even if they didn't know every word, well, very few people know every word. There are a lot of obscure and rare words, but in terms of the general understanding of what the Torah means, everybody knew that. And in fact, that's how the Jews of different countries spoke a lot of times. If there was sometimes contact between a Jew from Sephardi countries or from Arab countries with a Jew from Europe, from Northern Europe, who spoke Yiddish, they wouldn't have a common language except Hebrew. So the speaking of biblical Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, was done sometimes when it was necessary. And certainly all the scholars could do it, at least in theory. When you constantly read the Torah, when you constantly write in rabbinical Hebrew, which is very close to biblical Hebrew, then certainly you could speak it to some extent or another. For instance, I myself can tell you from my experience, I didn't really learn modern Hebrew, but I learned the Torah, I learned the Mishnah, I learned the Mishnah Brura and the other books that are written in various versions of Hebrew, whether it's biblical Hebrew, like the Torah, or rabbinical Hebrew, like the Mishnah and like the Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim. So I'm able to speak to an Israeli. If an Israeli doesn't know English, I can speak to him or her, in theory at least. There are certain words I don't know, but we could basically discuss almost anything. I could describe almost anything. Sometimes when they speak very fast, I don't understand them. That I have to admit. But at least, in terms of the Hebrew being a dead language for thousands of years, it's simply not true. By us, it's so important to teach children Torah, and the Torah was such an important part of our life, that people always knew Hebrew. Now when I became a Baal Tshuva, I was born in the Soviet Union, I didn't know much about Judaism when I came here to this country at 14, and I became interested in Judaism around maybe a couple of years later, and I began to observe Shabbat about 3 or 4 years later. So when I started learning the Hebrew, I was learning first the writings that are written in a very simple and classical Hebrew, like the Mishnah Torah of Rambam, the Maimonides. His language, they call it golden language. It's very clear, very simple to understand. There's not so many words you have to know to understand it. And I also learned the Chumash, the 5 books of Moshe, and Rashi was a little bit hard for me at that time to learn Rashi. Rashi is using far more Aramaic words, and it's far more complex than learning Rambam. But to understand Rambam and also Mishnah and the written Torah, it wasn't even that difficult. It took me maybe a couple of months to learn it on the level that at least I understood most of the words, because there's not so many really new words. The Hebrew is using the same roots for verbs, for nouns, for adjectives. It's really not so many words you have to know to understand it. So my point is that Hebrew, if I could learn it in 2 months, certainly the people hundreds of years ago that used to learn it from childhood, just the fact that they could pray and could listen to the Torah readings already gave them quite a lot of knowledge of Hebrew. Now, this wasn't a a language with which people spoke to each other in various countries, because in every country the Jews would have their own language. Of course, the most commonly known is the German Jewish language, known as Yiddish, and that's what most of European Jews spoke. But like I said, if two Jews met from different countries, and that happened sometimes, and certainly they wrote letters sometimes, and I'm not even talking about rabbinical writings. Almost all rabbinical writings were written in Hebrew, whether it's in Sephardi lands, in Arab countries, in Europe. The Jews were always speaking, or at least writing, in the same language. There was no difference when Mishnah Berurah quotes Sephardi poskim, those that the Asian Jewish rabbis, versus when he quotes the European Jewish rabbis. It's the same Hebrew, it's the same exact language. They all understood each other, and like I said, they could probably speak to each other if they had to. We know, for instance, that one important rabbi about 300 years ago, Rabbi Natan Adler, he had a special person come from Sephardi lands to teach him the specific accent that Sephardi Jews have a better pronunciation. They know how to pronounce the ayin, a strong sound. You know, it's not just a vowel. Most Ashkenazi Jews, European languages, don't have an ayin in them. So most Ashkenazi Jews just pronounce it as the vowel of it. But the Sephardi Jews pronounce it correctly. So he was teaching him those types of sounds that Ashkenazim don't really know well how to pronounce. I knew, by the way, one Ashkenazi rabbi who was a Baal Koreh, who learned the Torah, who knew how to pronounce the ayin. At first I was surprised because I was accustomed only to hear it by Sephardim, and then I hear how he said Sephardea, and you could see how he's clearly pronouncing the ayin. But that's unusual among Ashkenazim. Anyway, so Rav Natan Adler had a Sephardi rabbi who taught him for a long time the exact correct pronunciation of various unusual sounds. And how do you think they communicated with each other? Certainly the Sephardi rabbi didn't know Yiddish. So my point is that Hebrew was not a dead language, but it was a language that was preserved mostly for holy things. The whole question is, why didn't the Jews for hundreds of years decide to speak in Hebrew all the time? Why did they have usually a language that's adapted from the language of the people they lived among? For instance, German Jews, Yiddish, French Jews had a special French la'az that Rashi uses a lot. So why didn't they have Hebrew as the main language of communication? The answer seems to be, and a lot of rabbis write this, that they specifically didn't want to use the holy tongue, such a holy language, for regular things. They made it in a way, especially in the exile areas, made it into a language that's used mostly for holy things, only for rabbinical writings, for halacha, for reading the Torah and writing commentaries on the Torah, and used a different language for secular things. There's even an opinion that that's what Avram's family did originally when they came from Aram, from Syria. They spoke Aramaic at home, and only for holy things they spoke Hebrew. Very interesting idea. I think Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky mentioned that specifically they want to remember they're in exile, and that's why they retained Aramaic. When they came from the exile from Babylonia, when they came back, they still spoke Aramaic. Now it's interesting, apparently not everybody agreed with this policy. It seems from the Talmud in various places that Rebbe, the author of Mishnah, was specifically fond of the Hebrew language. He used to say, why speak Sursi? Sursi is a Syriac version of Aramaic, one of the versions of Aramaic that was spoken in the times of about 2,000 years ago, the beginning of Common Era, more or less. That's what was spoken in the land of Israel, and before that too. And Rebbe, of course, composed the Mishnah in the Hebrew, not in Aramaic language. The Talmud was composed in Aramaic language, both Babylonian Talmud and the Talmud of Eretz Israel. The Talmud was called Yerushalmi, Jerusalem Talmud. They're both composed in various versions of Aramaic. But the Mishnah, earlier than the Talmud, about 300 years earlier than the Talmud, it was composed in pure Hebrew. So Rebbe, the author of the Mishnah, actually says it openly that he loves the biblical Hebrew or rabbinical Hebrew. Of course, in his time, Hebrew changed a little bit, but even in the times of the Bible, the Hebrew did change over the years. It was a 1,000-year period, so the Hebrew of Chumash is not the same as the Hebrew of the latest books of the Bible. But whatever the case may be, the Hebrew that Rebbe used, he said that why would you use Syriac? Why would you use Sursi when you could talk in Hebrew? And he thought it's a beautiful and better language to use always. And apparently in his household, people actually spoke Hebrew. It says that some rabbis used to come to his maidservant, a shivcha, that knew Hebrew better than them, that they would ask her, they would hear from her what various words mean, because they were so accustomed in the Rebbe's household that everybody, even the servants, knew the Hebrew language. So whatever the case may be, we definitely never forgotten. There were always books on grammar of Hebrew, of course, written in various generations. There was never a dead language in a sense in which, for instance, Latin is a dead language and used only for prayer for certain people. And most Catholics don't know Latin even when they go to the church, from what I understand. It's not like they know Latin. Even take English, for instance. Read Shakespeare in the original. Very difficult to understand, and that's much closer to art. This is nothing. It's not a long time period. It's not like Latin, and certainly not like Hebrew. And yet, with Hebrew, anybody in any generation who learned the Torah would know what the main vocabulary of the Torah they would have. By the way, Russian, for instance, it changed even more than the English. It's very hard to read anything in Russian that's a few hundred years old. So languages generally change quite a bit, and people forget them quite quickly. It's only because of the mitzvah of learning Torah and learning Torah in the original, and specifically learning the Hebrew, which our sages emphasize the importance of it. That's why the Jewish people never really forgot it. What the Chidush, the new thing about modern Hebrew, was specifically to use ancient words to adapt to certain modern concepts. So there are a few words that came from biblical roots or from the roots of the times of rabbinical Hebrew that were needed in modern Hebrew. That is understandable. The truth is this process happened long before modern Hebrew. For instance, the word for button, right, the shirt button, is kaftor. Kaftor is a biblical word, but it meant a little bit something else, but the form, probably the shape, was somewhat similar. So they started using this word for a button long before the creators of modern Hebrew and long before Zionism. Or, for instance, there is nowhere in the Tanakh that coughing is mentioned. We do find the sneezing mentioned. Sneezing is mentioned, coughing is not mentioned. Obviously people coughed. It just happens to be that in biblical Hebrew we don't know how people coughed. It's not even clear in rabbinical Hebrew. If goneach might mean it, but it's not exactly clear. So what did the Jewish writers do? So in medieval times they used the word she'ul for coughing based on medical books. I think they took it from Arabic. So I'm just saying that the process of adapting an ancient language to certain modern things or certain new things that are just not mentioned anywhere in ancient writings, that process was always going. It was just speeded up in recent times. And there's, of course, a lot more words needed in recent times. But in earlier times, people just described to each other in various ways. Sometimes they use a local word. For instance, in different writings, the word for an orange was used differently. A lot of times it was used based on a local language. Pomerans, for instance. You'll see in various writings, depending on where the rabbis lived, they would use different words for oranges. Or for instance, vodka. A lot of Ashkenazi rabbis used to call it yain saraf, yaish, right? Like a burning wine. There is no vodka, of course, in rabbinical writings. They didn't drink anything any strong as that. But once Jews ended up in Poland and similar countries, they needed a word for it, so they called it a burning wine. And in modern times, they started adding more of such words and standardizing certain things. Like the word for coffee, for instance, kave, coffee, all kinds of spellings in various rabbinical writings. So in modern Hebrew, they decided on one specific spelling. This is how coffee will be called. Or tea, te, right? This is how we'll spell tea from now on. Tea, there were not so many possibilities, but with coffee, there are tons of possibilities. There's at least a dozen different ways coffee was spelled in various countries by Jewish writers. With regards to orange, by the way, they chose this is one of the methods to use already an existing word and to add a description to it, meaning the tapuach is an apple. So they called it tapuach zahav, golden apple. That's what orange is called in Hebrew, tapuz, abbreviation for tapuach zahav, golden apple. And potato was called apple of the earth, tapuach adama. So that's the kinds of things that you find, and like I said, a lot of times it wasn't even in times of the modern Hebrew. Some of these were introduced earlier than modern Hebrew, but the modern Hebrew only added more words of that type and expressions and standardized certain things. That's all. And on this I'll end for today. If you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.